Firstly, good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to everyone who's joined the webinar from UK, Europe, South Asia, and US. By way of introduction, my name is Ashwin Kumaraswamy, trustee of Bridge India. And for some of you who don't know about Bridge India, it's a charity set up here in UK, was set up 18 months back to create a platform to enrich the narrative on India, about India, and for India by bringing together lawmakers, policymakers, entrepreneurs, investors, academia, civil society, students to come together to help shape and set agenda for India and to act as a true living bridge between India and the world. Whilst the organization has offices currently in UK, we are in the midst of talks to expand it across mainland Europe, US, and Australia. I'm really honored to be moderating today's webinar session on Indian foreign policy. Firstly, thank you for all the eminent speakers who have taken the time out to come and talk to us. And the beauty of the speakers around us, they've had and continue to make a significant impact on foreign policy narrative towards India. And so I welcome you all. In terms of introductions, if I can start, Ambassador Rao. Thank you and welcome to Bridge India's webinar. She's the former Foreign Secretary of India, having been India's ambassador to US, China, Sri Lanka, and has been a significant voice globally on Indian diplomatic matters. Welcome, ma'am. Sri Manish Tiwari, former Minister for Information and Broadcasting, Government of India, and Member of Parliament, and also an eminent lawyer. Thank you, sir, and welcome for our webinar session. Ms. Dunya Mamoon, former Foreign Secretary, Foreign Minister, Government of Maldives, and a big advocate on human rights issues. Thank you, ma'am, and welcome to our session. And finally, if I may say, friend of the house as well, Rahul Roy Chowdhury, Senior Fellow at IISS, focusing on South Asian matters. Thank you, Rahul, for joining the webinar. The reason for choosing the subject of the webinar was, I'm sure you would all agree, today we are living in a state of flux, a far cry from soothing mantras of globalization that we had until just a few years ago, or as Samuel Huntington put in his thesis, Clashes of Civilization, which talks about how people's cultural and religious identities will be the primary source of conflict in the post-Cold War world. The primary characteristics of the world politics today are changing. There's rebalancing of the global economy and polity, sharpening contradictions between some nations or old alliances. Whatever the outcome, it will have a big impact on the world in a significant manner, and it'll change our thinking and probably in time create new approaches. From an Indian context, it's been 6 years Prime Minister Modi came to power in India and went around the world building massive PR for himself and India. His slogan of Ek Bharat, Shreshtha Bharat resonated well with Indians all over the world. But in the last 1 year or so, has his foreign policy come under stress? We have had abrogation of Article 370, CAA, never-ending Indo-Pak tussle, recent Indo-China tensions at the border, wherein India lost 20 of its brave soldiers for the first time since 45 years on the Indo-China border. Nepal Parliament's discussing a new political and geographic map of to include parts of India. There are tensions on the Bhutan-India border, India-Bangladesh border, increased Chinese activity in the Indian Ocean. In this context, what we thought was it's useful to understand what is India's foreign policy today, where's the big idea, what are the opportunities, threats, and what should India do in these difficult times or strange times. So given the context, I couldn't have thought about a much better panel to put together. So welcome you all, and if I may start with Ambassador Rao to give her thoughts and take it from there. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Ashwin, and thank you, Bridge India, for inviting me to be a part of this distinguished panel. Let me start by saying that I would challenge really the topic of today's webinar, which talks of the taking stock of India's foreign policy at the end of year one of Prime Minister Modi's second term. For one, given the continuum between the first term of Mr. Modi's prime ministership and the second, it follows that the foreign policy under Mr. Modi has to be assessed over a linked period from 2014 to the present. Secondly, issues and priorities in foreign policy do not redefine themselves generally because the leader of the country may have received a fresh mandate, unless, of course, there are decisions to be made which are kept pending because an election is due and the result awaited. For example, relations with neighbors are bound by the same diktats and compulsions, core interests and concerns, and in fact, such core interests and concerns are carried over by successive governments, and very often there is a consensus across political divides when it comes to such foreign policy concerns of a core nature. For instance, let us take issues such as cross-border terrorism, trade concerns, border settlements, issues of national security that impinge on relations with neighbors, just a few examples. Thirdly, the Foreign Office bureaucracy that serves successive governments remains the same, and in the Ministry of External Affairs, particularly the senior levels of the bureaucracy, are those upon whom the political leadership in power relies on for advice on the foreign policy directions to be followed. So there is, it's the same set of people involved. So approaches and attitudes do not change fundamentally or drastically as far as a country's foreign policy is concerned. And this perhaps accounts for the basic conservatism, as I would call it, entrenched beliefs, and yes, risk aversion in India's foreign policy, despite assertions to the contrary. Window dressing, image building through high-profile events like leadership summits or foreign visits, where India's intention to be a major and leading power are constantly emphasized. So it's against this backdrop that we need to look at the balancing scale of achievements and setbacks in foreign policy. And I believe that a year is too short a time in which to draw unequivocal conclusions. Also, whatever the time frame involved, the strength of a country's foreign policy can derive from its internal tenacity only, economic or developmental, the stability of its society and strength of its democracy, and its state capacity, and I believe this is the most important factor, the state capacity to deal with internal challenges, natural or man-made, that it faces. And that is why the internal transformation of India into a middle-income developing country that is rapidly reducing inequality and poverty, rapidly improving infrastructure, improving the ease of doing business with a stress on the openness of markets and transparency of the regulatory framework, improvements in labor productivity, cost of doing business, ensuring a stable and welcoming environment for foreign investment and capital. All these are important factors. And insularity of outlook and questions raised abroad about the management of diversity of India's social fabric cannot be dismissed entirely as interference in internal affairs, as they affect the way a country is perceived by important players on the global stage and important institutions of global opinion. In a way, they create a tow in the tide that is pushing India closer to its destination as a major leading power. They impose a credibility cost. India's foreign policy priorities, as always, are focused on our neighborhood and on the countries with which we share land and sea borders, including China, the countries where large sections of Indian citizens or persons of Indian origin reside, the sources of our energy security, the Indian Ocean countries, and fellow democracies like the United States, with which we share a relationship of vital and crucial importance, especially in the maritime dimension of the Indo-Pacific, and as a major defense partner, Japan, the European Union and the United Kingdom, and of course the enduring links with Russia. However much these may have, in a sense, acquired a slightly faded look over the decades. Ties with multilateral institutions are also important, obviously, particularly from the socioeconomic and developmental perspective. In the midst of all this, of course, the coronavirus pandemic is a constant factor in the internal and external policy dynamic that surrounds us today. And its impact is felt in all spheres, most particularly on the human and economic security affecting the country on both internal and external fronts. If there's one factor, I think, that sets our current government apart from previous administrations, it is the overarching importance being accorded to nationalistic opinion in determining foreign policy moves and maneuvers. You see it with Pakistan and now also to a lesser extent with China. The greatest risk is allowing these forces to dictate policy implementation. It's as if, that implementation is determined by the outcomes that happen domestically, or, whether it's fighting an election or whether it's, the impact on domestic audiences. And our Pakistan policy has already run aground on this Inchcape rock. I'm sure an English audience will know what I'm referring to. And it's hoped that our China policy will not in the same fashion. So the areas of focus today for the Modi government are obviously China, the United States, South Asia, and all these three factors can't be considered in isolation. The influence of China is, of course, a preponderant across this spectrum. And the perception today, which is perhaps shared across the world, is that China's rise seems unstoppable despite the pandemic, and that the United States is, in comparison, a diminished power, although the weight of US influence and the capacity to deploy power is still very formidable. As far as our neighborhood is concerned, we see the rising tide of Chinese influence, and this is much more than a China card that our neighbors may have played before. China has entered the tent, as it were, in South Asia. And you see it in Nepal, where the balance is very tilted to China's side at the moment. And what are the challenges facing India? I mean, there are obviously very real challenges facing India at the moment. And I think the next priority after, this China crisis is to some extent mitigated, I'm sure, will be to turn attention to Nepal and to see how we can, make our position more improved there. The other, we also seem, I think, to have, in a sense, jettisoned our commitments within SAARC, within the South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation. And that's been happening even before this second term of the Modi government. The focus on looking east through BIMSTEC, the Bay of Bengal strategy. Not that these are bad orientations, not at all. I think we need to, provide more substance to any Look East policy, or Act East as it's called, Act East policy that we have. But the neglect of our South Asian identity, I believe, comes at a cost, and where we should focus on greater trade connection, just infrastructural connectivity, regional integration. South Asia is really meant to be an integer. And I think that aspect and and India's unique ability, I think, to be able to see a South Asian commons develop, I think, hasn't been focused on sufficiently. Now, what is the world going to look like after Corona? Obviously, it's going to be a much changed global order where differences and competition are accentuated, especially between China and the United States. And does a country like India need to be swept up in the undercurrent of such competition? Or do we devise our own middle power balance with countries like Japan, with South Korea, also with the European Union, even as we continue to develop our close ties with the United States? I think countries like France and Germany particularly are important in this connection. But the ties with the United States will be preponderant, particularly in the military and security sphere. Sometimes some analysts say that perhaps we are securitizing that relationship too much, given the problems we face in the trade sphere, trade area, the immigration area with the visa issue now, the H-1B and the F-1 visas for our students there. And then given what has what has happened in Galwan and the near breaking point reached in relations with China, and then the attempt now to achieve some level of de-escalation and disengagement. How do we keep the channels of communication open with China? This may lay us open to the criticism that our foreign policy is neither fish nor fowl, but our geopolitical situation demands it. And most important, I think, for India is our internal transformation, whether it's development, our internal stability and security. All these are intertwined and cannot be detached from each other. I think I'll stop here and we can discuss this further later.
Thanks, Ambassador Rao, for that. If I can tease out 3 points that you mentioned, which struck to me was conservatism in our thinking and outlook, building capacity, and we need to look at our own backyard, in that sense, South Asian identity. Those for me are some of the 3 points which are quite telling with this government, and this is where I use the word, Ek Bharat, Shrestha Bharat, that macho, ultra-nationalistic pride which Modi government came on the scene. I think it resonated well amongst Indians all over the world. I think so to that effect, it was trying to find a way of trying to see what's happened so far in the regime. And I agree, it's 1 term or 1 year is a too short a time to understand a government's track record. But probably that's the right time to bring in Manisha on that point to have his comments and remarks and then take it from there.
Thank you, Ashwin, and thank you, Bridge India, for hosting this webinar on assessing 1 year of the second term of the NDA-BJP government insofar as their foreign policy is concerned. It's always a very tough act to follow Ambassador Rao, who's one of our most consummate diplomats, and she's given a very pervasive overview of India's foreign policy over the decades, as also what our priorities and our thrust areas are. So therefore, without disagreeing with her, or rather endorsing substantively what she's had to say, let me confine myself to 1 or 2 things which I feel are germane in today's context. It's a non sequitur that there's been overarching political consensus insofar as India's foreign policy priorities are concerned, going all the way back to 1947. If I recall correctly, the first time when we had a very vigorous debate in our newspapers with regard to a foreign policy issue, it was in 1995 and 1996, when there were divergences over whether India should sign the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty or not. And eventually, of course, coupled with that was that should we test once again after 1974. But if you look at governments and administrations across the board, more or less each successive administration has picked the ball from where the previous government left off and tried to carry it forward. I think the most classical example was the next steps in strategic partnership with the United States of America, which was initiated by the Vajpayee government. But when Dr. Manmohan Singh became Prime Minister, he carried it forward and in fact elevated to a different level, which eventually got India and the US to sign the Civil Nuclear Agreement in 2008. Similarly, if you go further back into the past, when Prime Minister Narasimha Rao in 1991 initiated the Look East policy, each successive administration that succeeded Prime Minister Rao's government actually followed through, broadened it, deepened it, and tried to give it a more gravitas, for the lack of a better word. So therefore, with this background, what really changed, or has something changed post 2014? Because as Ambassador Rao was correctly pointing out, I don't think it's appropriate that we evaluate the first year of the second term of the NDA BJP government. It would perhaps be far more appropriate that we actually really evaluate the past 6 years. And I think one thing which changed, and pardon the terminology if it sounds a little undiplomatic, is that we had a certain spectacleization of diplomacy. So therefore, you had style, triumph, substance in terms of how we decided to conduct our foreign policy. There was a greater emphasis, and that emphasis still continues, about summit level contacts, about personal chemistry, rather than a more institutional approach, which Indian foreign policy through successive administrations had followed over the decades. Now, when you have such an emphasis on the personal aspect of, or the personal chemistry when it comes to determining relations between sovereign nation states, there are obvious pitfalls. And I think what we are currently seeing in the context of China is that one classical pitfall, where, notwithstanding the fact that Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping met over 17 times in the past 6 years, it could not prevent the worst escalation on our border since 1975. And I think this should be a wake-up call for the NDA BJP government. They need to go back to the drawing board. They need to reassess as to whether this emphasis on style as opposed to substance is something which is really detrimental to India's national interest. And I think that's a debate that we will have internally in India with a lot of vigor in the days ahead. Another thing which I think is also equally germane is that we will have to follow a far more enlightened policy towards our neighbors. What's really played out with Nepal in the past 2 or 3 months is something which has been festering for a while. It goes back to our blockade of Nepal in 2015. And like the previous blockade, which was under a Congress government, I have no hesitation in saying that it was ill-conceived, and therefore it has left a residue of bitterness, which has possibly emboldened the political class in Nepal to embark on a course which I think is neither in Nepal's interest, and definitely which is not in India's interest. And if you were to broaden the canvas, even in the pre-COVID times, you have an extremely distracted United States of America. United States of America, which has been bled almost white by 2 long wars, which they fought in Afghanistan and Iraq, respectively. And right from day one, President Trump has been trying to disengage the United States from its overseas commitments and try and sort of pull back into a more Jeffersonian mode. And over a period of time, despite the axis of adults, as John Bolton puts it in his book, President Trump seems to have really succeeded in doing that. Insofar as Europe is concerned, even pre-Brexit and of course post-Brexit, things have substantively changed. I think our relationship with the European Union, the needle has not really moved. The free trade agreement is stuck where it was in 2008. And of course, this government has decided to sort of pull back on some of the historical positions that we had with regard to the non-aligned movement, with regard to our commitment to Palestine, etc., without really replacing it with an alternative framework. So therefore, to really sum up, I think you've seen a lot of ad hocism really define our foreign policy positions and postures as this government tried to possibly make a break from the past and mold foreign policy in their own particular way. But I guess as things stand today, and it's an evolving conversation, we seem to have really fallen between a couple of stools, not just two stools. And I would stop at that.
Thanks, Manisha, for that. If I were to summarize, what you're really saying is there's an overarching political consensus on India's foreign policies, but there's lack of institutional approach which is being followed in the last 6 years compared to the previous tenures. And India is probably need to relook at its engagement with its own neighbors if it wants to really be the superpower that she aspires to be. So that's probably the right point to bring in Mr. Nur Mamoon, former foreign minister, government of Maldives, to give a perspective of what India's neighbors think about India's foreign policy. Over to you, Mr. Mamoon, and welcome and thank you for joining the panel.
Thank you, Ashwin. At the outset, let me thank Bridge India for your very kind invitation. It's indeed an honor to join all the distinguished panelists for this discussion. India is, of course, a country that I deeply respect. Known as the world's largest democracy, India's achievements, particularly in the international arena, are remarkable. Its growing economy and emergence as a world superpower should be noted. Let me also commend the government of Prime Minister Modi. It was an honor for me to have attended his inauguration in the earlier term. I have, of course, visited India a number of times and continue to admire and to closely follow, obviously, the developments that are going on there. Let me also wish India all the best in handling the challenge of COVID-19. Indeed, these are troubling times for all our countries, and I would like to also thank India for the continued support we have received, not just for COVID, but during other crises and for the development of my own country. Maldives and India have civilizational roots and shared historical development which stretches to thousands of years. Indian pop culture and music are indeed very popular in the Maldives even today, and perhaps cricket is the only missing thing in completing the circle of Indian popular culture in the Maldives. Mind you, my father, former President Gayoom, is an enthusiastic cricket fan and, of course, a very close friend of India himself. The affection that Maldivians have for India provides the ideal ground for building and for maintaining and fostering a strategic relationship that is mutually beneficial and that promotes security and stability in the Indian Ocean. Because a stronger and secure Maldives is good for India, and India can help its own security by helping the Maldives to become stronger and more independent. Let's look at the past 1 year. During the past 1 year, the Maldives have become even more dependent on India on almost every aspect of social and economic activity in our country. And that is not good news for either Maldives nor for India. Here is why. Over-dependency on just one country will make the Maldives more vulnerable, and we will not be able to exert any significant leverage in negotiations. And this will make my country weaker, and it's something I'm very concerned about. I hope India's strategic planners realize sooner rather than later that a weaker and dependent Maldives is not good for India's security interests in the region. A weaker Maldives would not be able to resist the pressures from third countries or offers from such countries that are commercially attractive, but strategically detrimental to maintaining stability and order in our region. We are all aware of the competition for power in the Indian Ocean, and I'm sure we have, my colleagues have mentioned already, the emergence of China and its power and the issues within the Indian Ocean itself. Prior to the election of President Ibrahim Mohamed Solih, we all spoke about Maldives' over-dependency on China for loan financing, and some people also spoke about a debt trap, and I think these are terminology we hear all the time. Immediately after assuming office, President Solis' government took a US $800 million loan from India, the terms of which have not been made public. What is known to date is, however, that almost all new infrastructure development projects, including the strategically important projects such as the new seaport in Gudifadu, are to be given or have already been given or to be given to Indian companies. The Maldives' dependency on India is also clearly manifested in the outbreak of COVID-19. Whilst again, we are grateful for the essential supplies for almost all areas of the response that has been brought from India, I believe that there is continued perpetuation of this dependency. At the same time, India was and continues to face its own challenges in responding to COVID-19 pandemic and has closed its borders and imposed export restrictions. No country should find itself in a situation where the fate of its medical emergency is entirely dependent on another country. So how do we overcome this? The Maldives, I believe, should be working to diversify its dependency. That is not replacing one dependency with another. The key building block here, or the key concept of course, for resilience is diversification. At the same time, we need to engage with the Indian leadership to build a level of confidence that the diversification of Maldives' external dependency would not cause a security concern to India. Transparency, dialogue, and through the established networks of diplomacy, we can make sure that we build that level of confidence between our countries. The Maldives has done that in the past, and there's no reason that we cannot do so now and for the future. During President Mohamed Abdul Gayoom's time, the Maldives and India enjoyed a relationship that was characterized by mutual respect. And the key word here is respect. We enjoyed relationships on equal terms in terms of respect for each other, though we are obviously way smaller and compared to India and many other countries. But I think we had a very balanced foreign policy. There was no over-dependency on any one country as such. Of course, there were times that Maldives have had policy preferences, especially on regional cooperation issues that were different to India. The Maldives have also had a close and constructive relationship with China and Pakistan in the 1990s and into 2007, and this didn't cause concerns to strategic planners in India at that time. Similarly, the Maldives understood the interests and perspectives of India on security and stability in the Indian Ocean region. And the Maldives publicly acknowledged India's role in maintaining order in the Indian Ocean and even worked with India to maintain it. We had a number of military exercises, for example, the Dosti exercises and joint operations between the security forces of the two countries, which started from the early 1990s. So our countries, I believe now, need to recalibrate the relationship to cultivate mutual respect for the differences and similarities that the two countries share. India is now a world power. It can afford not to expect transactional reciprocity in the relationship with the smaller neighbors, such as Maldives. What it can and should reciprocate is respect. India can afford to show respect for differences of perspectives in policy choices and avoid situations that can be perceived by some as zero-sum outcomes. India can afford to create the strategic space and encourage smaller countries such as the Maldives to build resilience, become stronger economically, politically, and in the security sector. This is not just the morally right thing to do. It is also the right policy. It is because it is in India's self-interest to ensure that smaller neighbors can remain strong and can resist the pressures exerted by other countries. And I think just to sum up, during my time in office as well, I think that government was seen to be very close to China. So what I see now is from 2008 onwards, we have kind of become caught up in this competition. So the different governments coming in have to be either pro-India or pro-China. And I don't think this is healthy for our country in the longer term. I think we can build respectful relationships and we can work with all these countries in our region, at the same time respecting the security interests in the Indian Ocean. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Ms. Mamoon. I think the key points for me, if I would say, was neighbours of India want diversification of their dependencies, and they're willing to do that by taking India in trust and confidence. And the key and the word respect and treat with everybody with respect are the key takeaway points. Thanks for that. Rahul, over to you now.
Thank you, Ashwin. I just want to confirm that I've unmuted myself successfully.
Yes.
I am excellent. Tragedy if I had it. Thank you all. Ashwin and Bridge India have set us an exam question on taking stock of the first year of the foreign policy of the Modi 2.0 government. So let me try to answer this specific question. Indeed, if there was one word to describe the past year, I think it would be that it posed a challenge to India's foreign policy. Indeed, I would describe India's diplomacy in the past year in relation to its neighborhood, especially, as reactive rather than proactive, with the reactive approach due largely to India's own internal political decisions rather than external factors alone. In this context, it is important to remember that Prime Minister Narendra Modi's landslide election victory just over a year ago marked the first time in nearly 50 years that an incumbent government had won an absolute majority with an increased mandate. It was not surprising, therefore, that domestic political and social transformation and not foreign policy considerations would become the top priority for the Modi 2.0 government. And this was quick to take place. We saw with two controversial decisions. On August 5th last year, Article 370 of the Indian Constitution providing special semi-autonomous status to Jammu and Kashmir was revoked. And on 11th December last year, the Citizenship Amendment Act to fast-track citizenship for religious minorities from Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan was passed in India's parliament. India emphatically stated that all these three moves and actions were an internal matter for India and did not necessitate any change to its external borders, including the line of control with Pakistan or the line of actual control with China. But these moves did exacerbate India's tensions with Pakistan and China, strained relations with Nepal, and raised difficulties with both Bangladesh and Afghanistan. While Islamabad argued that India's actions in Kashmir were illegal and a violation of the UN Security Council and its resolutions, Beijing opposed Ladakh's new administrative status as being unacceptable and as undermining its territorial sovereignty. Kathmandu objected to the inclusion of areas it considered to be disputed in India's new map, and both Bangladesh and Afghanistan strongly rejected the view that minorities faced religious persecution in their country, with Bangladesh going further and expressing concern over a prospective return of illegal immigrants from India. As a result, in effect, India's diplomacy became predominantly fixated on mitigating the negative international consequences of its internal actions. And success in this endeavor, if we are taking stock of the last 12 to 14 months, success in this endeavor has been mixed. Criticism of India's actions, including its strict lockdown in Kashmir, mounted in the international media and among several states, including some members of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. This affected India's standing as the world's largest democracy. The first meeting on Kashmir in nearly 50 years took place in the UN Security Council in August last year. And US President Donald Trump publicly, on more than one occasion, offered to mediate a peaceful resolution on the Kashmir dispute between India and Pakistan. In effect, the internationalization of the Kashmir dispute, the prevention of which had long been at the very heart of India's diplomacy, took place. In April this year, the annual report of the US Commission on International Religious Freedom also listed India as a country of particular concern for the first time in over 15 years. And Nepal issued its own new map on the 20th of May this year, showing for the first time the disputed areas with India as part of Nepalese territory. Yet, Indian diplomacy has had key successes as well in the last 12 to 14 months. India firmly rebuffed the US presidential offer of mediation, having consistently maintained that there was no third-party role in mediating bilateral disputes. The UN Security Council meeting on Kashmir was held on an informal and closed-door basis, with UN Security Council members in attendance failing to agree a joint press statement. Subsequently, all the permanent members of the UN Security Council, with the exception of China, stated that this was not the forum in which to raise the Kashmir dispute, as it was a bilateral matter for India and Pakistan to resolve. Moreover, ensuring US diplomatic support lay at the very heart of India's mitigation strategy in this regard. A state visit to India by President Trump in February this year was not only symbolic of their enhanced bilateral relationship, but sent a powerful message to the international community of US support to India amidst challenging times. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates also supported India bilaterally, even though they had multilaterally agreed to the OIC critique earlier on. Indian diplomacy also ensured that Pakistan failed to secure the support of a sufficient number of states to submit a resolution on Kashmir at the UN Human Rights Council in September last year. In May this year, the Maldives supported India in the OIC, highlighting strengthened bilateral relations. To conclude, therefore, although India's actions in Kashmir resulted in greater international attention and scrutiny, Indian diplomacy successfully ensured that Kashmir remained a bilateral issue with Pakistan and averted international mediation. As we go forward, India's foreign policy in its neighborhood and beyond is likely to find new opportunities, including for vaccine diplomacy amidst COVID-19, becoming a champion of global economic revival as it prepares to host the G20 summit in 2 years' time, a new outreach from the UK post-Brexit and post-COVID, pragmatic perspectives towards the Indo-Pacific, a possibly new framework for relations with the Gulf region, and a neighborhood policy which could focus on regional stability and security. In essence, I strongly believe there is now an opportunity for India's foreign policy, especially in relation to its neighborhood, to reset in order to become proactive once again, rather than be simply reactive for the second and third years of the Modi government. We shall see what takes place. Thank you.
Thanks, Rahul. And the key points, takeaways, I'll probably draw to conclusion is India's foreign policy so far has been reactive, which needs to be reset to make it more proactive, and relook at neighbors and recharge the engagement process. The reason we posed the question of taking stock was, if you look back at history, when Pandit Nehru was the prime minister, that was a time when India took its high moral ground and whilst being conservative in the thinking and building capacity. He said, you know what, let's take the non-aligned movement forward and not get associated to any of the powers to be at that point in time. But post in the 70s, Madam Gandhi came to power, and she said, you know, let's build up our defense capacity. And then rightly or wrongly, we went down a pathway with Russia at that point in time. And where come to 2000s, we had the civil nuclear deal that we stuck with the United States, which again was a turning point. But today, India aspires to be the permanent member of the Security Council, coming back to the Ek Bharat, Shresth Bharat, the macho nationalistic sort of upbeat Modi's government has put together. If you look at that from a political standpoint, and the way he's creating waves both internally in India and externally, the foreign policy, whilst it's been continuous and there's a large consensus, somehow there's a feeling there needs to be much more proactive engagement, especially in the changing world. And that was the real context of why we thought to pose that question. And to that effect, I think I've got about 13 or 14 questions that have come about. I'll probably start off by asking Ambassador Rao, what is India's next big foreign policy idea, if it may be? Because I know the current Foreign Minister, Jai Shankar, at a speech in Brookings Institute last year, talked about a more muscular policy. So he didn't, I think people at large need to understand that idea of what is that muscular policy. But if she can throw some light to us on what she thinks about the next big idea, it'd be a great starting point. Ma'am, I think you're on mute.
Well, I think we should start with the here and now and the situation that we are embedded in at the moment. And a lot of the speakers, eminent speakers before me just now, talked about the need to be more proactive in our neighborhood. And I'm not sure if that means showing muscularity in our neighborhood, because I'm reminded of what the present foreign minister's father said some years ago, and I would like to read from that quote. He said, this was in 1986, he said this: India must take a relaxed view during crises with neighbors and extra-regional interference. And those days, apart from China, we had our eyes on the United States also. This was before, our current, the improvements in relations with the US. Because, and this is what Mr. K. Subramaniam said, I quote, in the longer run, the imperatives of geography, cultural affinities, international politics, and developing global economic stresses and strains will bring home to our neighbors the facts of life and of realpolitik. And I'd also like to quote from Ambassador Umashankar Bajpai, the son of Sir Girja Shankar Bajpai, who was the Secretary General in the Ministry of External Affairs soon after independence. And this is what he had to say: India must abandon the desire to be recognized and certified as the prime power in the region. His view that it could only reflect our inferiority complex. Ambition is legitimate, but it has to be earned. Now, the question here, the crux is, how do we earn that, how do we get our neighbors to concede? I mean, Foreign Minister Mamoon just mentioned, the fact that there has to be mutual respect between neighbors, and particularly between India and her neighbors. And I think where our smaller neighbors are concerned, I'm not talking of China now, that is a completely different ballgame. But as far as our other neighbors, and I'm leaving Pakistan out also, I think there has to be, that setting in which each of our neighbors feels that it's a fair play with India. I mean, they are getting a fair deal out of their relationship with India, that we don't seek to superimpose our ambitions, and here I use the word, on our neighbors, because it has to be a two-way street. And it's extremely vital for our security and stability that we maintain that equilibrium, not a low-level equilibrium, but a proper equilibrium in our relations with our neighbors. So that has to be a priority. And the second priority, I believe, is to see, after Galwan, how we are going to, again, restore an equilibrium in our relationship with China. It's all very well to indulge in high emotion and very high decibel reactions to what happened there. It was a tragedy, no doubt. But I believe that if you are sharing a border of over 3,000 kilometers with a large neighbor like China, you have to create, again, a modus vivendi with that country. The modus vivendi that you structured over the last 3.5 decades, in a sense, has frayed at the edges. Perhaps some would say has weakened at the center, at the core itself. So that is going to be a tremendous challenge for the government. How is it going to restore that balance in the region? Because if you're going to have a conflict-ridden relationship with China, it is going to completely distort the balance in the region. And it's going to distort the internal balance also for us, because our priorities then become, determined by what is happening in terms of defending ourselves on the border with China. And I think we need to take a sensible, rational view of these matters. It's not that this is not a dilution of national honor. It's not that we are being less patriotic when we seek that kind of equilibrium with China. It is in our interest. And at this stage of our development and at this stage of our growth as a nation, we need to come up face to face with that and take the proper rational decisions. So.
Thanks, ma'am, for that. Manisha, probably I'll come to you with this next question. You wrote an article on China's weaponized its history. In your view, how should India engage and bring about that equilibrium with China at this point in time? Because it's not just about the border; it's about economics as well. Whilst India is strong in by and large IT services on software field, whereas China has got a lot to offer still to India around the manufacturing. It's a very complex issue, and how to bring. What's your thoughts,
sir? No, I think, Ashwin, the more germane question is, the more relevant question is, why is China behaving the way it is at this current point in time? I think that question needs to be answered by every strategic analyst around the world.
Correct.
Because the border dispute between India and China is not new.
No.
The first attempt to define the western or the northern border between India and Tibet was made as far back as 1898 by Mr. MacDonald. Who, in fact, the dispute at that point in time was between the British Protectorate of Hunza and the claims which Hunza had, Tibet, which had deemed sovereignty, or China had deemed sovereignty over it. And those overtures were not either reciprocated or responded to by the Chinese. Similarly, in 1913, when the similar conference was convened by McMahon to try and delineate the eastern border, the Chinese representative initialed on it, but then ultimately did not sign when the conference opened for signing. So the dispute between India and China, insofar as its perception of borders is concerned, predates the existence of the People's Republic of China and predates the existence of India emerging as an independent country. So therefore, there was no real inflection point for China to behave in the manner that it has done. And the reason is very clear. You see, China has created 3 inflection points or 3 distractions in order to wipe the COVID-19 headlines off the world media. They went and announced 2 administrative districts in the South China Sea. They have moved on the sovereignty of Hong Kong with the new security law. And they have deliberately created a situation on the border with India, knowing fully well that when you have 2 countries with nuclear weapons and a third country also on the tri-junction of that conflict with nuclear weapons, obviously you are going to get global attention in a different way. So therefore, the thing which I think Indian strategists need to figure out is why now. And I honestly feel that all this talk about abolition of Article 370 and its repercussions, our border with China is a whole lot of hogwash. I mean, Pakistan, if between 1947 and 2020, has redefined the internal administrative arrangements of Pakistan occupied Kashmir and the northern areas, I think more than a dozen times. In fact, we don't have time at this moment. Otherwise, I could have sequentially led you through each of the changes which has taken place between 1949 and 2020. So therefore, you are actually seeing a different China after President Xi took over. And President Xi's dream to try and sort of put China back into that space of being the Middle Kingdom before what they called the century of humiliation, has led it to take extremely aggressive postures, not only with the Belt and the Road initiative, but also in the kind of economic undertakings that they have undertaken, not only in South Asia, but in Africa, in Latin America, and South America, where you've extended loans, and when those countries have defaulted, you've actually grabbed their territory in return. So China has been behaving like a rogue state, and I use that word with full responsibility, ever since President Xi has taken over. Coupled with that, China has the blood of millions of innocent people on its hands. You see, whether by design or by default, or whether the COVID-19 virus is lab-driven, or China did not report the implications of the virus in time, and especially keeping its own airspace closed in order to stop the virus from spreading internally, and coercing other countries to keep their airspace open and allowing Chinese to travel outside, when they fully knew that there is a pandemic which can have across the board repercussions, is nothing but a criminal act. And the World Health Organization, the international institutions which were created in the wake of the Second World War, in fact, have completely failed humanity. The United Nations Security Council was not allowed to meet for a month when the pandemic was raging, just because China happened to occupy the chairpersonship of the United Nations Security Council at that point in time. Even the G20, which was created in the wake of the meltdown, the global economic meltdown, has not been able to measure up insofar as the pandemic is concerned. So therefore, when the biggest crisis after the 1918 pandemic confronted humanity, you see a collective failure of the institutions of global governance and criminal neglect on part of the World Health Organization, which actually in the initial days completely and absolutely played the Chinese game in order to try and suppress the impact of COVID-19. So I mean, I'm sorry to sound harsh and blunt, but I think there is a need to figure out what China is, not only for India, but for a lot of other people who believe that the 21st century has to be a century where everybody has to grow together and not one country growing on its own.
Thanks for that. Probably, Rahul, I've heard you speak about the Quad a few times, and probably the best time to bring you into the conversation here is why is China behaving the way it is at the current point in time? There's been a lot of strategies to counter China, and India is located in a very interesting manner, both economically as well as geographically, to be used as a containment to China. What are your thoughts? What should the world do, and what should India do in that sort of a context?
Thank you, Ashwin. Before I begin to answer this question, could I just go back to an earlier remark one of the panelists made? I think Ambassador Nirupama Rao raised a very important question of how we deal with our neighbors, especially our smaller neighbors. I want to refer to that. When I talked, in fact, of a proactive diplomacy rather than reactive, I did not mean a muscular diplomacy. I actually meant that it was important for India to be more imaginative, to be more flexible with its neighbors, learn some of the lessons, hear some of the concerns that the neighbors have, but then act in a way that is able to reconcile India's core national interests in relation to the neighborhood, whether in bilateral terms or in multilateral terms, but be quite firm about it. So in a way, I'm arguing for a policy that actually is more diplomatic based, is more economic focused, is more multilaterally led, despite, and I should add that despite provocations from Pakistan-based terrorism against India. We've seen the killing of Indian soldiers on the line of actual control. So I think the big challenge for the Modi government going ahead in terms of security for the neighborhood, which is the key foreign policy issue for India, has to be to try to find out and try to do better, I think, than it has so far in terms of via media with the smaller countries particularly. And that relates very neatly to the Indian Ocean and to your question on the Quad. It's very important to see that in the first Modi government, there was a very clearly articulated policy towards the Indian Ocean. It was the first time any Indian Prime Minister had talked about the Indian Ocean for decades. We had at the IISS Shangri-La dialogue in Singapore 2 years ago, the Prime Minister of India, Prime Minister Modi, articulate his vision for the Indo-Pacific and India's role in the Indo-Pacific. And I think what we're seeing now is that the focus on China is paramount. I mean, this is something that has changed. I don't see that we are going back to a sort of pre-15 June position in relation to China in terms of the security challenge that it poses us. And so the question then comes, well, how do you counter China's expansionism, as the Indian Prime Minister said, though without naming China? And clearly the relationship with the Quad, the group of 4 countries, the US, Australia, Japan, and India, become key to this attempt to counter China as we go into the next few months and years. Now, the Quad itself, India has had its position toward the Quad has ranged from being ambiguous to supportive. But I think it's very important to give a clear signal as to what it hopes that the Quad achieves. I mean, is it going to be primarily an economic infrastructure focused grouping? Will it have a foreign policy and also key a security element? For example, we have meetings of the Quad at the foreign ministers level. We have meetings of the joint secretaries, director general level in the foreign ministry, but there's no meeting of the Quad of defense ministers. There's no meeting of the Quad of defense officials. And these are the key aspects that we'll be looking at as to what India's position is on this. I mean, will it initiate a meeting of defense officials, for example, senior defense officials of the Quad? I mean, those are the signals that would be pertinent not only to the other Quad members, who sometimes are a bit frustrated over the ambiguity that India has shown in the past, and also to China. So I think the key, the Quad now does become a key aspect of India's diplomacy in relation to China, but also the issue of Quad Plus. Should there be other countries involved in this? Should countries like France, the UK, if they're willing, become partners with India on a Quad Plus formation? So what I said in my remarks is there are opportunities now that present themselves, and India has to be active and proactive in taking advantage of these opportunities that are emerging, including on the issue of the Quad.
Thanks for that, Rahul. Talking about Indian Ocean, Ms. Mamoon talked about respect, and then it's important that India understands the neighbors' perspective and treat them with confidence. One of the key points that I would like to understand is India's got a very good soft power that it's displayed over a number of years. whereas China's view of the world is, you know what, we provide you infrastructural debt or provide you economic power to empower countries, be it in the Indian Ocean as well as in Africa. What's your thoughts on India's soft power? Has it sort of plateaued, or can India do a bit more on that and link that to more impactful re-engagement and realignment with its neighbors and also outside the Indian Ocean?
Yes, I think you have actually raised a very valid point here. India, I think when I first started off with my remarks, I spoke about it being the world's largest democracy. And of course, as a young democracy, Maldives has a lot to learn from the experience of India and other countries. You have strong institutions, especially your judiciary and other independent institutions. One of the problems that my country faces as a very young democracy is that we had only introduced political parties, let's say just 10 years ago. And we are still struggling with the fact that many of our institutions are politically very influenced. And especially when your elections commission or your judiciary is politically influenced, it's difficult for our country to mature and grow. And so there are a lot of areas where India has given us the support and where we do look forward to continuing that engagement. You mentioned in terms of hard power. I think it's difficult for India to compete with China in terms of, for example, loan financing or infrastructure projects. We have a bridge that was built with Chinese support in the last government, and of course a lot of infrastructure projects. So I think the problem is India trying to compete with China in that way. Of course, our engagement, our relationship is very different to these two countries. I remember also in our history, GMR, I think, has been talked about a lot, had a very major project in the Maldives, which the public were very concerned about. And this was changed. And this subsequently, we had a lot of bullying, I would say, by India in terms of trying to influence our policies and governance on this. And I was in government and had to go through and face this, which I think really did not leave very good memories for me in terms of the engagement with India. So I think these issues have to be tackled, that we might be small and very weak, maybe we don't have a very strong voice even, but we also are an independent country. We don't like to be bullied by any country. And that's something that our government at that time and the people did stand up to. So learning from that experience, I would say, yes, I think we have that respect, but the respect can only be earned, I think, as Madam Nirupama mentioned earlier. And we do look forward to maybe adjusting the relationship for that. And let us also continue to enjoy our links with China or other countries, because those engagements are important for Maldives development as well. And I see India as being very possessive, very jealous of any other links that our country might have. And I think it's time we moved on from it. If I can just make a small point, is the COVID issue came up, and I think there was a lot of discussion about how it emerged in China and China's role. I don't want to comment on that, but I do want to say, I do feel the international system has failed. And I think especially the powerful countries had time to deal with this issue, but we have not seen the international cooperation we would have liked to have seen, including in the UN or in the Security Council, to address this issue. And it could have been, I believe, prevented had we taken, not prevented entirely, but the level it has gone to now. And I feel sometimes there's a lot of finger pointing and blaming, and WHO being blamed or China being blamed. Okay, maybe mistakes happen, but we should move on from there. And now we should come together to deal with this, especially in our region. We do look forward to continued support also from India and the regional collaboration in addressing this issue. Thank you.
And thanks, ma'am. Ambassador Rao, if I can come to you, you've served in China, you've served in Sri Lanka, served in US. Under Deng, China talked about economic empowerment, and it used, let's strengthen our economy better. And today, where it's at a stage where the world is looking at supply chain security, rightly or wrongly, there's no point blame game here. China, world needs an alternative to China. Can India provide that alternative to China in terms of manufacturing or supply chain security, or should we empower Indian states to engage with different parts of the world to bring in those relationships to provide that alternative without actually antagonizing China? I think one of our previous webinars on China post-COVID world, we did talk about India and China could work in synergetic way. But from your own experiences and thoughts on how China evolved from intertwining economics and defense and foreign policy, is there a learning for India to do in that sort of a sense?
Thank you. Before I answer your question, I'd like to just reference Ms. Mamoon's remarks just now. While I've often felt that between India and our neighbors, we certainly need to build a relationship of mutual respect and trust and confidence. And I believe that ultimately the geomagnetic field in which we live draws our neighborhood towards India very closely. And that's a force of nature that you cannot really avoid. And I believe our neighbors would agree with that. But in terms of, since this thing was brought up about the Chinese presence in the region and what has happened today, take even, the Sri Lanka or the Maldives, or to some extent Bangladesh, the extent of China's UN diplomacy, the kind of infrastructure that they've built up, the kind of debts that our neighbors have raked up vis-a-vis China. So all that also needs to be factored into by our neighbors when they talk about the neighborhood and how India and China are together becoming, competitors, as it were, in the neighborhood. Now, I know that China has some strengths in terms of, the pace of implementation, the amount of, the deep pockets that it has today. I mean, I don't think, India has reached that level as yet. It'll take some time before that. But the fact is that China's presence in the region has introduced a completely different factor into the neighborhood situation today. And it's nowhere like it was 10 years ago. And, if India is perceived as quote unquote bullying, well, that's unfortunate. And I think we need to address those concerns as far as our neighbors are concerned. I am not saying that we should go into complete denial about it. But the fact is that our neighbors also need to look at how the China factor is influencing Indian attitudes to them today. Because obviously India's security involves a neighborhood in which we enjoy the fullest confidence and trust in relations with our neighbors. And also that our neighbors look at India with confidence and trust, understanding where India's concerns come from. So I think that we need a more mature conversation about these matters between India and our neighbors. So much binds us to the rest of South Asia. In a way, China can never be bound to the region. However much, it brings money, or it brings skills, or it brings, pace of implementation, or it just brings its newly found influence as a power. All that is very well, but I think that magnetic field, shouldn't be disregarded or ignored. Coming to your question about the supply chains and can India really, substitute for China, or, if business is leaving China today, because a lot of countries, regardless of what our South Asian neighbors may say, they may feel completely sanguine about China. God knows, really how they feel about China, but that's the impression that is being given. But look at the wider Indo-Pacific. Look at what the Japanese think of China. Look at what Australia, look at the bullying talking of bullying, if you look at the wolf warrior diplomacy that China is engaged in today, I think we're all ready to do a double take. This is not the China that, as you said, was Deng Xiaoping's China. Yeah. This is Xi Jinping's China. And Xi Jinping is talking about achievements for China, China first, the China dream. There's a very bloated sense of self that China has today. I think many of the countries in the region realize it. Some of them don't talk about it, but many of them articulate it. And they are really looking for a rebalancing, and they're looking to build closer relations with democracies. They're looking at how this, we can provide alternatives to the BRI. We can provide growth corridors that are more transparent, that are more open, that are more rule bound. So I think our neighbors in South Asia should also take note of these trends around the region, because China's rise has come with a whole lot of, if they think it has come with positivity, there's a lot of negativity also that has come with China's rise. So when it comes to supply chains, a lot of countries are looking at diversification of supply chains. Of course, China's own internal market makes it, inevitable that a lot of supply chains are also embedded there, and also the kind of globalization processes that we've seen over the last decade and a half, where so many multiple centers of manufacturing and component development have come into being. So all that is going to take time to that decoupling that people talk of with China is not going to be very easy. I think where India is concerned, I think a lot of people look at India by virtue of its huge market, its great potential in terms of talent, scientific and IT manpower, for instance. But we have to look at things like labor productivity. We have to look at things like the cost of doing business, land availability, just the openness of our markets, our regulatory environment. All that, I think, has to improve, and this should be an occasion for the government to really kickstart those processes. So if that does take place, and I do hope it will take place, if the government seems to be quite intent upon ensuring this and learning from, the shortcomings that may have plagued us in the past. If you're able to do that, I don't see why India can't be that replacement country.
And thanks for that, ma'am. One of the other questions that's been posed to us is, and this is classic, this would come in all the panels, India aspires to be the permanent member of the Security Council. What should India do to get to that point? And on one hand, it aspires, rightfully so, to be on the high table of the world superpowers. But we are coupled with some issues in our own backyard. Manisha, you've chronicled well in your article about China's under Xi. Your thoughts on what could India do more proactively to ensure that there's more that route to get to United Nations permanent membership of the Security Council?
Ashwin, I think that the permanent membership of the Security Council is something which is frankly overrated. What COVID-19 has really exposed are the worst fault lines in the Indian social, political, and cultural milieu. What India requires is 30 years of internal consolidation. We require space for consolidation. And for that, we require a peaceful periphery. I do not think that it is appropriate for us to delude ourselves to believe in believing that we are a rising great power. I'm sorry, in a country where 800 million people currently are on food support, we are definitely not a rising great power. And I think the sooner we get real about it, the better it would be. So therefore, as I was earlier pointing out, that the institutions of global governance will have to be reinvented. The status quo of 1945, which is the United Nations Security Council, cannot perpetuate itself into perpetuity. But that will happen when it will happen. See, the reason why India also got respect internationally was that India's economy from 1991 to 2016 was consistently on an upswing. even after the great economic meltdown of 2008, India grew at 6.7% in 2007-8. India grew at 9% in 2009-10 and 9.5% the next year. India's economy, unfortunately, has gone south from the March of 2017. Yeah. So therefore, when your economic heft diminishes, your ability to punch to your weight also goes down substantively. And if you look at the current projections, and these projections, factor in only the first 7 days of the lockdown in India, we are currently looking at a GDP growth rate anywhere between minus 7.2% to minus 3.2%. And if you go by any rational economist, it will take us a decade to be able to come out of the hole that we've dug for ourselves because of demonetization, a badly implemented GST, and now the lockdown, which has only flattened the economic curve and not the disease curve. So I think there is a reason for Indian policymakers to get real about our capacities, about our capabilities, which require a lot of effort, which require a lot of rebuilding. And we should try and batten down our hatches, which doesn't mean that we go into isolation, but we need to batten down our hatches and really start concentrating on fixing things internally within India. I will just make one last point with regard to what my dear friend, Mr. Rahul Roy Chaudhary, had said about the Quad. The fact is, Rahul, that if you go back to 2006 and 7, it is not India which sabotaged the Quad. The Quad was sabotaged by Australia. You had the Australian foreign minister standing next to the Chinese foreign minister and saying that they don't want to be a part of Quad. If you read former Foreign Secretary Shyam Saran's book, in fact, the Americans sent a message to the Japanese to actually pull back on the Quad because they thought it was impacting their trade relationship with China. And even the United States of America, which is the pivot of the Quad, is today a completely distracted part. So therefore, if you are going to have a Quad in the strategic or in the military sense of the word, who is going to be the linchpin of the Quad? If, let's say, President Trump gets re-elected in November and he continues with the policies of withdrawing America from its international role and its international commitments, where essentially is that going to leave countries like India, which let's suppose if they go into a formalized Quad arrangement, would be left completely high and dry if the US decides to do a U-turn overnight. And if you read John Bolton's account of what really goes on in the White House, it could be one thing one day and completely another thing the other day. So till the time you do not have stability and commitment by the other principal players of the Quad, to expect India to do heavy lifting, I think is asking a little too much of India.
Thanks for that, Manish. I would love to continue the conversation, but it is getting to a time where it's probably dinner time in India and as well. So we've got quick last comments from all the panelists, and we can draw this fabulous webinar to a conclusion. Rahul, if you want to start first.
Just to say, I think that I believe strongly that despite COVID-19 and the additional pressures that have come because of it, we have to look at the opportunities that are bound to come. We've got to take advantage of them. I think we've got to look at the neighborhood in a way that provides some flexibility, but also is for which we're able to pursue our own national interests and perspectives. And I think in terms of the Indo-Pacific, again, there's an opportunity. So in a way, it will really be whether India's foreign policy is able to effectively meet the challenges of leadership as we go into the next few months and years.
Thanks for that, Rahul. If I can come to Ambassador Rao.
Well, I agree with what Rahul has just said, and I think the focus now, obviously, India's focus is not only as within the country as far as dealing with the coronavirus pandemic is concerned and dealing with the economic fallout of that, which should be our priority, but also the situation on our borders, especially with China. And these are going to occupy time and space for an indefinite period, I see. So the priorities seem to be so changed from what they were perhaps a year ago. We don't know what it's going to look like a year from now, since we started with assessing the first year of the second term of the government of Prime Minister Modi as far as foreign policy is concerned. Foreign policy is very much determined by the internal situation within the country. And today that internal situation is very much focused on public health issues. It's focused on the economic state of well-being. And that focus cannot and will not go away so easily. But I hope once all this is over, we will have time to pay really close attention to the relations that we have with our neighbors, particularly countries like Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, the Maldives. Afghanistan we didn't talk about in this discussion today, but that situation also is going to, I'm sure, occupy our attention, particularly because of the Pakistan factor, but particularly because of the re-emergence, as it were, the reincarnation of the Taliban, and that obviously is going to cast its shadows on everything that we have done in Afghanistan since 2001. So these are all serious issues, I believe, that will require our attention. But for now, I think the focus must be on what India needs at the moment, given the anthropological threat of the coronavirus pandemic and the economic fallout of that.
Thanks, ma'am, for that. Ms. Mamoon, come to you for closing remarks. I think you're muted, ma'am.
Okay, now I'm on. Yeah, I wish India all the best in its quest to find a seat in the UN Security Council. I think India is an important international player, and it would be good from a country such as the Maldives to have India on the Security Council itself. As you know, there's a lot of discussion on UN reform, the fact that the developed world really needs to have more voice in the functioning of the UN itself. And I think for that would be an important step. Of course, I understand that domestic concerns and the issue of COVID, public health, a lot of poverty remains in India. So those challenges remain, and I wish India the best in meeting those challenges. But I think India has built a respect for itself and will hopefully continue on that path. And I'm sure in terms of engagement with its neighborhood, with the neighborhood first policy of Prime Minister Modi, we in the Maldives definitely look forward to continue a very strong and warm historical relationship and to be on, to have continued mutual respect for each other and to work together. The reality of China, we're all aware of very well. And I think, as colleagues have mentioned, there's different aspects to our relationship with different countries. But when she mentioned deep pockets, I think as a country such as the Maldives, where our people are still seeking further development, which actually does include a lot of things like you need housing, you need schools, you need better hospitals. So for those things, I think we do have different choices, and we will continue to seek the support whilst keeping India's security concerns in mind. So thank you again for this opportunity. I think it was a very useful discussion.
Thank you, ma'am. Manisha, finally coming to you, closing remarks.
No, thank you, Ashwin. I think whatever needed to be said has already been said. Just to throw in my two-penny bit, I think India's foreign policy needs a larger reset. And unfortunately, that reset is not going to happen over the next 4 years. Unfortunately, administrations do get caught in traps which they set for themselves. And with this government, it has happened in the first year of its second term. So therefore, what you would really see is a lurch from one crisis to another, a short-term firefighting approach, rather than a longer view of India's strategic interests, both in the neighborhood and globally, and try and then define a certain trajectory. The other problem which this government faces in terms of foreign policy is that it does not have the ideological space now to be able to make those readjustments. Especially in the case of, let's say, China, where you alluded to the economic relationship that we have, an aspect which I was not able to touch upon at that point in time. The manner in which the government has dialed up the rhetoric internally, I think it's going to be extremely difficult for the government to dial down that rhetoric in the short term. And whether we like it or not, global supply chains are not going to really transform themselves overnight. China would still continue to remain the factory of the world for the foreseeable future. And that's going to be a critical challenge for India going forth, that when a bulk of the global manufacturing actually comes out of China, a lot of manufacturing which happens in India is dependent upon Chinese inputs. How are you going to be able to disentangle these threads? For example, I do not see Huawei being allowed to now do 5G trials in India. If the government, after what's happened in Galwan, allows Huawei to go ahead with the 5G trials, there's going to be blood on the streets. And so therefore, I think when you dial up the nationalistic rhetoric, which this government has done way too often in the past 5 years in order to tamp down on domestic public opinion, there are international consequences, and they will now have to live with the consequences of their actions.
Thanks for that, Manish. And I take this opportunity to thank all the speakers on behalf of Bridge India and myself for giving us the valuable time to comment and share your expertise and knowledge with us. Hopefully, Bridge India will continue to bring some of these aspects more into on a topic of its own. Let's hope India continues to respect its neighbors. Proactively engages on the foreign policy front, which is much more complex. It's not one-dimensional; it's multi-dimensional. Saying that, I thank one and all for being part of this webinar. Thanks a lot, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Much.